Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
When my father died, my sister told me not to expect anything. She leaned in, all fake sad, and whispered, "Don't be surprised if you get nothing." I just nodded. I didn't ask why. I already knew. See, my dad never really liked me. I wasn't the Monroe mold. I didn't marry rich. I didn't stay quiet. I didn't pretend everything was perfect like Laura did. But I stayed. I showed up for birthdays, for Christmas, for him, even when he didn't care. So at that will reading, I was ready to hear I'd been cut out. What I wasn't ready for was a second envelope. And when the lawyer opened it and cleared his throat, he said something I'll never forget. This one was updated after a very revealing conversation. That's when the war started. And trust me, nobody knew what kind of game I'd been playing all along. The day of the funeral felt like walking into a country club on Judgment Day. The weather was too perfect. Blue skies, a gentle breeze, even birds singing like they didn't know someone was being buried. The Monroe estate looked exactly the same as always. Immaculate, cold, and way too proud of itself. Just like my father had been. I wore black, of course, but not the sleek designer kind Laura had on. Mine was simple, off the rack, bought 2 days before. She probably thought that said everything she needed to know about me. Everyone was there. Old colleagues of Dad's, business partners, some distant cousins I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral 22 years ago. The kind of people who showed up not out of love, but out of obligation and maybe a little curiosity. Because everyone knew Richard Monroe didn't do anything small, including dying. He left behind a big legacy, a bigger house, and the kind of wealth that made people fake cry, just in case there were eyes on them. I kept my distance. I stood near the back, behind a couple of shrubs, just enough to see the polished mahogany coffin, but not close enough to have to listen to the preacher's voice trying to inject emotion into words that didn't belong to him. My hands were dry. I hadn't cried. Not yet. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because it had all been drained out of me long before he died. Laura, on the other hand, played the role of devoted daughter like she was up for an award. Clutching pearls, literally, perfect smoky eyes, comforting people who didn't ask to be comforted, making sure everyone saw her being the pillar of the family. Every time she looked over at me, I could feel the subtext. You don't belong here. And honestly, I wasn't sure I did. After the burial, there was this weird in-between time. People didn't quite want to leave yet, but they didn't want to be the first one to grab a canapé either. That's when Laura came over to me. Her heels clicked on the stone like she was walking on a runway, not a graveyard. She leaned in, all perfume and condescension, and whispered like we were gossiping at a brunch table. "Don't be surprised if you get nothing." Then she smiled, not a kind smile, the kind of smile you give a fly before you swat it. I didn't say anything. I didn't even flinch. Just looked her dead in the eye and let the silence sit there, heavy and hard. That's the thing about people like Laura. They expect you to beg, to protest, to lose your cool. Silence unnerves them. It makes them wonder what you know. I knew plenty. I knew that our father hadn't been a warm man. I knew that when Mom died in that car accident, he poured all his grief into business and image and ignored the fact that he had 2 daughters, one who needed comfort and one who learned early how to perform it. I knew that Laura had always known how to make herself indispensable, how to stay close enough to his wallet and his heart to get what she wanted. And I knew that I didn't play that game, because every time I tried, I ended up feeling like I'd swallowed broken glass. People talk a lot about being the black sheep, but that always makes it sound kind of romantic, like you're wild and misunderstood. Truth is, being the black sheep just means you're forgotten until it's convenient, like when someone needs help moving, or when someone dies and there's property to divide. I didn't come for the money. I came because even after everything, after all the years of barely being acknowledged, I still felt like I had to see it through, like maybe somewhere deep inside, he'd left something for me, Not money, just something. A word, a letter, some sign he'd noticed me standing in the background all these years. That hope was stupid. I knew it the second Harold Kessler, our family's lawyer for as long as I could remember, shook my hand after the service. He looked tired, not funeral tired, guilt tired, like he knew something I didn't. We exchanged a few pleasantries, nothing deep, nothing that would make Laura raise an eyebrow. But just before I turned to go, he said something that made me pause. "There's something I'd like to go over with you, tomorrow, just us. No explanation, no expression, just that." Laura was watching from across the patio, holding court with two of Dad's old friends, probably trying to lock down what she assumed was already hers. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, running through every moment I'd ever shared with my father. There weren't that many. A few awkward phone calls, a birthday dinner when I turned 30, and he forgot my job title. The time he almost said sorry after Mom died, then switched the subject to the stock market. And then there was one more. One night, 3 days before he died. He'd called me, out of nowhere, said he wanted to talk. I'd driven out there. We sat on the back patio, drank tea like strangers. And then he started talking, rambling almost. But there was a softness in his voice I'd never heard before. A slowness, like he was digging into parts of himself he didn't usually touch. And then I did something I hadn't done since I was 17. I recorded it. Not out of malice, out of instinct. Because something about his tone told me this conversation would matter. I never told anyone, not even my boyfriend. But as I sat in the darkness of my apartment, hearing Laura's voice echo in my head, "Don't be surprised if you get nothing," I finally understood something. She was scared, not of me, of what she didn't know I had. And tomorrow, when I sat down in Harold's office, I was going to find out exactly how much she didn't know. The next morning, the sky was gray in a way that didn't feel accidental, like the weather had finally caught up to the mood. I drove across town with that kind of quiet, pulsing tension that you feel in your throat more than your chest, like something big is about to happen, but no one's told you yet what it is. Harold Kessler's office was in a sandstone building that probably hadn't changed since Reagan was president. Heavy doors, long hallways, old carpet that smelled like dust and secrets. Everything about the place made you feel small, like even if you walked in 6 feet tall, you'd walk out with your shoulders down and your pride tucked into your bag. Laura was already there, of course. She was never late for anything that involved money or image. She sat by the window, legs crossed, holding a cup of tea like it was part of a photo shoot. When I walked in, she didn't look up right away, just gave me a half-second delay, and then a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind of smile people wear at funerals when they think they've won something. Harold came in last. He was still the same, gray suit, polite, professional, but something about his face looked different this time, tighter around the mouth, like he was holding something back, something sharp. He set his briefcase on the table, clicked it open with a care that almost felt performative, and pulled out a folder sealed in one of those old-school manila envelopes with the string you have to unwind. It was labeled in my father's handwriting, "Primary Will." I recognized the handwriting immediately, slanted, neat, just like the birthday cards he used to sign best wishes instead of love. Harold cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. The words were dry, clinical, and devastating all at once. To Laura Monroe, I leave the family estate, including all properties under the Monroe Trust, as well as the majority of the liquid assets and securities therein. She has proven herself reliable, committed to family traditions, and capable of continuing the Monroe legacy with appropriate care. To Emma Monroe, I leave the portrait of her mother, Margaret, currently hanging in the main hallway of the house. Let it serve as a reminder of the warmth and gentleness Margaret brought into our lives. I felt it like a punch. Not the fact that I wasn't getting money, I'd come in half expecting that, but the way it was phrased. Like he was handing me a keepsake from a museum exhibit. Not something I had lived and breathed through. My mother wasn't just warmth and gentleness. She was fierce, funny, messy, and human. And the idea that all of her was being reduced to one oil painting, like a consolation prize for the daughter who never quite fit, made my skin crawl. Laura shifted in her seat, and for a second, I thought she might smirk. But then I saw it. The twitch in her jaw, the flicker in her eyes. It wasn't satisfaction. It was anxiety, the kind you get when the play's gone off script. She leaned slightly toward Harold. "That's it?" she asked too casually. Harold didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached back into the briefcase and pulled out a second envelope. This one was smaller, the paper heavier. I could see the edges were worn, like it had been handled a lot in a short amount of time. "This," he said slowly, "was added to the file 3 days before Mr. Monroe's passing. It was handed to me directly, with explicit instructions that it be read only in the presence of both daughters, and only after the original will was disclosed in full." Laura straightened up, lips pressed into a hard line. I didn't move. I couldn't. My stomach had gone cold, and every sound in the room seemed far away. I watched Harold undo the clasp and pull out a single sheet of paper, folded once, with another smaller item clipped to it. Something I couldn't quite make out. He unfolded the letter and began reading. To be clear, my original will reflects the structure of legacy I had always intended. Logical, predictable, perhaps even fair by traditional standards. However, in light of recent conversations, and with certain truths made clear to me that I had been blind to for far too long, I have made amendments I believe to be necessary. Not out of guilt, but out of a desire for integrity in the final chapter of my life. To Emma, I leave controlling interest in the Monroe Trust. She may do with it what she sees fit. To Laura, I leave the estate, but without fiduciary power. There was silence. Thick, ugly silence. Then Laura spoke, voice sharp like broken glass. "This is a joke. This wasn't him. He wouldn't change the structure of the trust. He said it 1,000 times. Stability, continuity, tradition. This doesn't make any sense." But Harold was already holding up the item clipped to the letter, a USB drive. "Your father also requested this be played, if there were any doubts." Now my heart was hammering, because I knew what was on that USB. I'd seen him speak those words, had watched his eyes when he said them, had sat across from him in that brittle silence while he admitted things he'd spent 40 years pretending weren't real. I hadn't expected him to use the recording. I'd just made it for myself, for closure maybe, but he had other ideas. Harold plugged the drive into his laptop. The speakers crackled. Then my father's voice filled the room. "I've made a lot of mistakes. I think I've spent more of my life trying to avoid admitting that than actually being a father to my children. I thought if I could keep everything running smooth, stay out of messy emotions, I was doing my job. Laura, you've always been good at managing perception. You gave me peace, but maybe not honesty. Emma, you never let me ignore things, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt." Laura stood up suddenly. "I'm not listening to this," she snapped. "It's doctored. You're letting her pull something here, Harold. This is manipulation." But Harold raised a hand without even looking at her. "Richard confirmed the contents of this recording in writing. It was notarized. This is official." She sat back down hard, like her legs gave out underneath her. The voice continued. "I don't want my legacy to be about money. I want it to be about trying, even if I tried too late. Emma, do what you think is right. You've always known the difference between what looks good and what is good." When the recording ended, the silence was louder than before. Laura wouldn't look at me. Her mouth was tight, her eyes shiny, not with tears, but with rage. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't say I told you so. I just sat there and thought, you spent your whole life pretending you were the smart one. But maybe the smart one knew when to stop performing and start listening. And I knew this was just the beginning. I didn't say a word as Harold shut the laptop with that slow, deliberate motion people use when they know something irreversible just happened. Like slamming the door of a burning house, knowing full well you were the one who lit the match. Laura sat motionless, jaw locked so tight her teeth were probably grinding down to powder, her knuckles bone white where she gripped the arms of her chair like she was trying to hold on to some version of reality that had just slipped right through her manicured fingers. There was a stillness in the room, the kind that follows a confession no one saw coming. And yet, once it's out in the open, changes everything so completely that pretending it never happened is no longer an option. Harold, still avoiding eye contact with either of us, began carefully organizing the documents back into the folder, but I could tell from the slight tremble in his hands that even he wasn't entirely prepared for the weight of what had just been read aloud. My father's voice, filled with a clarity and sadness I had never heard from him when he was alive, now echoing in a room that had always been used to contracts and clauses, not regrets and redemption. The moment was saturated with something unspoken, something raw, like we had all witnessed a man tear himself open with his final breath and leave the mess for us to interpret however we chose. Laura, for all her venom and poise, didn't shout this time. She didn't accuse me directly or scream about forgery or threaten lawsuits like I halfway expected. Instead, she turned slowly toward me, her voice low, brittle, and unfamiliar, like it had been dragged through gravel. "You manipulated him," she said, not as a question, but as a verdict she had already delivered in her mind. "You waited until he was weak, confused, and you fed him the story, made him think he owed you something." I looked at her then, really looked, and I saw it. Not anger, not even betrayal, but fear. Fear that she hadn't been able to control everything. Fear that her version of the truth wasn't the only one that mattered anymore. And in that second, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped until that moment. Laura didn't just care about the money, the estate, or the trust. She cared about being right, about winning the story of our family, about being the one who held the narrative together even if the pieces didn't fit. She needed to be the center because if she wasn't, everything else, our childhood, our mother's death, our father's coldness, would unravel into something she couldn't manage. "I didn't manipulate anyone," I said, my voice steady, not raised, not theatrical, just quiet and solid like the truth should be. "He called me, I showed up, I listened, that's all. That's more than he ever let me do before." Laura laughed, a short, humorless bark of sound that bounced off the polished wood of the office walls. "You were always so desperate to be seen, so pathetic, always hovering around the edges like a child waiting for scraps. There was a time, not so long ago, when those words would have broken something inside me, when her dismissal would have felt like confirmation of every lie I used to tell myself about not being enough. But now, in this moment, sitting across from her with the weight of my father's voice still lingering in the air, I realized she didn't have power over me anymore. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped needing her approval. "You're right," I said, not sarcastically, not bitterly, just honestly. I was desperate, not for attention, for connection. I wanted him to see me, yes, but more than that, I wanted to understand why he never could. And now, I do. Harold stood up then, clearing his throat again, as if trying to politely announce that the room needed to exhale. "We'll proceed with the legal transitions as outlined in the addendum," he said carefully, his eyes moving between us like he was still trying to avoid triggering something explosive. "If either of you wishes to contest, you may of course pursue that through the courts." "I'll contest," Laura said quickly, but the words felt thin, deflated, more like a reflex than a threat. "I'll find someone who'll see what this really is." Harold nodded, but his face told a different story. The kind of look that said he'd been through enough of these family dramas to know how they usually ended. And it wasn't with someone clawing back control they'd already lost. I stood up and didn't look back at Laura as I walked out. I could feel her eyes burning into the back of my coat, searching for some weakness, some last-minute tell that she could twist into a narrative where she still came out on top. But there was nothing left for her to find. The car ride home felt like I was driving through someone else's memory. I couldn't stop hearing his voice. "You've always known the difference between what looks good and what is good." That one sentence, more than anything else, undid decades of silence. Because it told me he finally saw me not as a shadow of someone else or a failed version of a Monroe, but as myself, messy and flawed and present. When I got home, I took out the old tape recorder I used to use in college for interviews. I still had the original file, the conversation we'd had on the patio that night, the one where he'd spoken so freely, I hadn't even needed to guide him. I remember how surprised I was at how much he wanted to talk, how little he interrupted himself, how different he sounded from the man who used to respond to emotion with spreadsheets and silence. On that recording, he talked about Mom, about how he'd pushed Laura to be perfect because she reminded him of himself, and punished me with distance because I reminded him of her. He said he didn't know how to raise someone who wanted the truth more than stability, someone who asked why instead of how much. He said he was sorry, not dramatically, not perfectly, but sincerely, in that flat, exhausted way people use when they finally stop lying to themselves. And when he was done, I didn't cry, didn't say thank you or I forgive you. I just nodded, even though he couldn't see in the dark, and said, "That's all I ever wanted." I didn't tell Laura about that part. She wouldn't believe it, and honestly, it wasn't for her. She thought she had lost the war because she didn't get the trust. But the truth is, the trust wasn't the victory. The victory was that, in the end, he saw me, and she couldn't undo that, no matter how many lawyers she hired. The following week unfolded in that strange, fogged-over rhythm that follows a seismic family shift, where time doesn't stop, but it stops making sense, where mornings come heavy with an unfamiliar stillness, and every phone call feels like it might carry another aftershock, another demand for answers from people who were perfectly comfortable in your silence until the moment your voice started to matter. I went back to work, returned my overdue library books, did my laundry, made grocery lists like I hadn't just shattered a legacy that was built on cold politeness and unspoken alliances, but underneath all that normalcy was a thrum of anticipation, like something unfinished was circling overhead, waiting for its next cue. It didn't take long for Laura to act. She showed up on a Wednesday, unannounced, like always. Entitlement dressed in heels and Chanel, standing in the doorway of my apartment with a forced calm that practically screamed of desperation. She didn't ask if she could come in, she just walked past me like the place belonged to her, as if stepping into my space would reestablish the order she believed had been temporarily disrupted, rather than completely overturned. I watched her scan the room the way a realtor would appraise a fixer-upper, judging every choice, every flaw, every imperfection. And I realized then that she had never seen me. Not really, because everything she knew about me was filtered through contempt. "I thought you might want to reconsider," she said, settling herself onto my couch with that practiced air of someone who's never had to ask twice for anything. Dad wasn't in his right mind. You know that. He was old, he was tired, and he was vulnerable to suggestion. I sat across from her but didn't respond immediately because I understood the game she was playing, and I knew better than to let her control the tempo. She expected me to be emotional, to fight back, to flinch. But I had nothing left to prove to her. No illusion to maintain, no debt to repay. What I had was knowledge, sharp, pointed, and real. And I could see in her eyes that she suspected it, that somewhere deep down, she was starting to grasp just how much I'd always known. He was clear, I finally said, calm and steady. He wasn't confused. He made a choice. Laura leaned forward, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap, her voice laced with false sincerity. "You think this is about the money, don't you? That I'm just angry because I didn't get control? But it's more than that. It's about respect, legacy, everything we've built. He and I worked on this for decades, and now it's in your hands. And let's be honest, Emma, you've never been part of this world. You don't understand what's at stake." There it was, the mask slipping just enough for the truth to peek through. I didn't smile, though I wanted to. Instead, I stood up, walked to my desk, and pulled out the folder I'd prepared the day after the will was updated. the folder that contained years of records, hidden property transfers, and one particular transaction that had always stood out to me. I placed it on the table between us and watched her face harden as she flipped through it, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she reached the page I knew would undo her. "You sold off the Cordova property 5 years ago," I said, letting each word drop like stones into water. "You told Dad it was condemned and that the proceeds went into renovations for the main estate. But the records say otherwise. It was never condemned. And the money didn't go into renovations. It went into a private account in the Cayman Islands." She stared at the page, and for the first time in years, she had no words. I didn't need her to admit anything. Her silence was enough. "I could take this to the IRS," I continued, my voice quiet, even, not angry, because anger would have meant she still had some hold over me. "I won't yet, but if you ever try to twist the narrative again, if you try to smear me or drag this through the courts, I'll do it. And I won't look back." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked down, away, anywhere but at me, and I realized then that the thing she feared most wasn't exposure. It was irrelevance. Because for the first time in her life, the story wasn't hers to tell. She stood up, her movements stiffer than before, and walked to the door, pausing just before she left. "You think he loved you at the end," she said, her voice low, bitter, laced with something that might have been grief or might have just been the loss of power. "But he didn't. He was confused. You were a convenience." I didn't answer because the truth didn't require defense. I watched her leave, listened to the sound of her heels disappearing down the hallway, and then I sat back down and let myself breathe. That night, I returned to the Monroe estate, the house Laura now technically owned, though it was me who held the strings. It stood cold and gleaming, a mausoleum dressed up as a family home, full of artifacts no one had touched in decades. I walked the halls slowly, alone, past the rows of portraits and antique furniture and perfectly staged rooms that had never hosted a real moment of warmth or laughter. There were no mirrors in the house. I hadn't noticed it as a child, but now, walking through as an adult, it struck me like a revelation. No mirrors in any room, as if the entire place had been designed to avoid self-reflection. As if our Father had built a kingdom where no one ever had to face themselves. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was the real legacy. Not money, not real estate, but silence, repression, a curated image polished to the point of emptiness. I stood in front of my mother's portrait, the one he'd left to me like a symbol or a curse, and I tried to remember her laugh. It took longer than I wanted. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't always feel like sorrow. Sometimes it feels like blank space, where memories should be. Sometimes it feels like realizing you've been walking through a museum of your own life, looking for something real to hold on to. And standing there, I made a decision, not out of vengeance or bitterness, but out of something quieter, more certain. I wasn't going to preserve this legacy. I was going to dismantle it piece by piece until nothing remained but the truth, not because I needed revenge, but because I finally understood that the real inheritance wasn't control or money. It was freedom. It's a strange kind of quiet that settles over you after the storm has passed. Not the gentle hush people like to romanticize in movies or books, but a deeper, more uncomfortable silence, the kind that forces you to sit with everything that's been said, everything that's been done, and, maybe more importantly, everything that was never going to be fixed, no matter how many truths were dragged into the light. In the weeks that followed the reading of the second envelope and Laura's failed attempts to reclaim what she saw as her birthright, the world didn't change in any dramatic or visible way. The city still pulsed with its indifferent rhythm, strangers still walked past each other on sidewalks with that practiced avoidance, and people still checked their phones more than they checked on each other. But for me, something had shifted in a way that could never be undone. I received more than a few calls from distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years, some of them drenched in faux concern, others laced with carefully measured flattery, all of them circling the same unspoken question like vultures waiting for something to fall apart. Was I really going to keep the control of the Monroe Trust, or was I planning to return things to the way they were, meaning, of course, the way that benefited them. I answered none of them, not out of spite, but because I had already made my decision in the echo of my father's voice, in the heavy, brittle air of Harold's office, and in the haunted corridors of a house that had stood as a monument to dysfunction dressed in polished oak and silence. I dissolved the trust, quietly, efficiently, without press releases or family meetings or dramatic gestures. I met with lawyers, advisors, accountants, people who looked at me like I was insane when I explained that I wanted it broken apart, not protected, that the money should go elsewhere, not into the hands of those who saw it as a reward for maintaining the illusion of perfection. The assets, once liquidated, were redirected toward women's shelters, scholarship funds for first-generation college students, legal assistance programs for people trapped in abusive conservatorships. In other words, the kinds of places that would never be invited to a Monroe holiday dinner, because they reminded people like Laura and her social circle that the world was more than private clubs and curated grief. Laura, unsurprisingly, didn't speak to me after our last conversation. I heard through the ever-reliable family grapevine that she was floating the idea of writing a memoir about the betrayal of wealth or some nonsense like that, spinning herself as the victim of a manipulative sister and a father too far gone to understand what he was doing. I didn't bother to correct the narrative because I had come to understand something crucial. People like Laura didn't seek the truth. They built monuments to their own version of it, and they guarded those monuments with every ounce of their energy, even when the foundation was nothing more than denial and desperation. I kept the house for a while, not out of sentimentality, but because it felt wrong to let it pass into the hands of someone who would marvel at the craftsmanship without understanding the rot that lived beneath it. I walked through it sometimes at night, barefoot on cold marble, pausing in rooms that had been cleaned so many times they no longer felt lived in. The absence of mirrors still bothered me. It had become symbolic in a way that was almost too on the nose, the idea that the man who built his empire around discipline and image couldn't bear to look himself in the eye after dark. One evening, I returned to the study, my father's favorite room, the one with the locked drawer I'd never had the key to. I had it now, of course. Harold had given it to me almost as an afterthought, not realizing, or perhaps knowing exactly, what it might contain. Inside was a single envelope, sealed in thick paper, marked in his writing, to be opened in 5 years. I held it for a long time, not because I didn't want to know what it said, but because I finally understood that the answers we chase don't always heal us. Sometimes they just sharpen the edges of what's already broken. I placed the envelope back in the drawer, locked it, and returned the key to the back of a book on the second shelf. Maybe I'll read it someday. Maybe I won't. Maybe the gesture was the message, a final test to see whether I'd become the kind of woman who needed closure carved into a sentence, or whether I'd learned that peace sometimes comes not from understanding everything, but from walking away with dignity and letting the dust settle where it may. People often ask me, quietly, hesitantly, like they're afraid of what they might stir, if I regret what I did, if I feel guilty, if it weighs on me to have upended a family legacy built over generations. And I always answer with the same thing, something my father once said that I've never repeated until now. The truth, Emma, isn't kind, but it is clean. No, I don't regret it, because in the end, what I inherited wasn't wealth, wasn't power, wasn't even justice in the conventional sense. What I inherited was nothing, and from that nothing, I built something better, not for them, for me.